In this lesson, we'll begin to break down vector graphics and learn about the key parts that make them up. All right, so now that we are familiar with both pixel and vector graphics and kind of what the difference between those two is, let's go ahead and go all the way back to step one. And we're going to begin to sort of break down vector graphics, because if you're going to begin to create vector artwork or vector drawings, then you need to understand really what the anatomy of a vector looks like. So now, as you can see here in front of me, vector graphics all start with paths. And you can see that right here. So in front of me, you can see that we have two different types of paths, and it's real easy to see the difference. Now, we have what's referred to as an open path, where the end and the beginning are separate. They don't meet. And then we have closed paths. Closed paths make shapes. And here are a few examples over on the right of a few different kinds of shapes. Now, I want to stress to you at this point that vector graphics at their core really don't have any colors applied to them. They're invisible. Now, you can see that I've kind of got a black and white color scheme going for this particular example, and I've done that just so you can see these paths. But the black color that's been applied to these paths is actually an attribute, and we're going to be looking at how we can apply attributes to our vectors here in a later lesson. But in this lesson, we're just going to kind of focus on breaking down the anatomy of vector graphics, and it all begins with a path. Now, if we were to come in and look here at these paths on the left, you can see that paths can be straight, they can be angular, they can be curved. Really, paths can take any shape or form. Now, if we come over and look at the shapes themselves, you can see, again, these are just a few examples. Really, what makes vector artwork unique is a vector piece is a composition that consists of multiple different vector objects, all working together to basically create the composition. So these, again, are just a few examples of vector shapes, but important to note that these are all closed. The beginning of the path gets closed with the end of the path. Now, the next step we need to take into vector anatomy, if you will, is anchor points. And you can see here, if I bring in this layer, that I've highlighted the anchor points on each one of these paths for you with a little red square. Now, it's important to understand that anchor points really are a core element of a vector graphic. Now, you can see on this path on the far left, it has two different anchor points. We have one at the beginning and one at the end of the path, whichever that is. So if the beginning is up here, we've got basically an anchor point at the beginning and at the end. Now, if we move to this path here, you'll see here that we have multiple anchor points in the center of the path. You can see here, if you really pay attention, each of these anchor points is located where the path changes directions. So there's a few different terms that we're going to be talking about in this lesson. Now, these are important terms for you to begin to recognize if you're planning on continuing on and learning about Adobe Illustrator here at Digital Tutors, because these are terms you're going to hear quite often. So we've heard paths, we've heard anchor points, and we've heard now corners. So on this particular path, each of these anchor points represents a corner. Now, anchor points don't have to represent a change in direction in the path. They don't have to have a sharp transition in direction. As you can see in this third path right here, we have an anchor point that lives right in the center of this path, but yet we don't have a sharp transition in the direction right here. We have a nice, subtle, smooth hump here in this path. Again, this path right here, only two anchor points. There's none in the center. But this path right here has one smack dab in the center of it. And again, it's helping to control the appearance of this path. So if we come over and look at the vector shapes, again, these top four shapes all consist of four different anchor points. You can see that the circle has them at the top and the bottom, the left and the right. The square and the rectangles, again, have these anchor points located at their corners. Now, just because a square has four anchor points, one at each corner, doesn't mean that it cannot have more anchor points, but a square is going to have at least four, one for each corner of the shape. Now, these particular shapes down here, I haven't highlighted each and every anchor point because they have significantly more, but I've given you sort of the general pattern of them. If we look at the two stars here on either side, you'll see that the stars have an anchor point at the tip of each of its tips, and then also at sort of this center where the change in direction is recessed into the shape. So if we look at this multi-tipped star, again, same thing. We have an anchor point out here at the tip of each of these protrusions, and we have an anchor point here at each one of these indentions where it changes direction. Now, the shape in the center is actually a piece from that logo that we looked at in the previous lesson, and this actually consists of multiple different anchor points. Now, this is a custom shape that I've made, but what you should know here is that each one of these squares doesn't necessarily represent one anchor point. As a matter of fact, there are probably, I think, 3 or 4 highlighted by this particular square right here. And more, I can't remember the exact number, but there's definitely more than one highlighted by this particular square right here. So I think what's important to take from this is that anchor points can represent a change in direction of the path, but they're really used to basically dictate the shape and control the shape. Now, we've talked about paths, we've talked about anchor points and corners. Let me just jump over here and bring in another layer here, because really when it boils down to it, a path can break down into multiple segments. Now, I've highlighted segments with these little blue triangular shapes here. So if we look here again at this very first path, you'll see that we have one path segment. Now, a path segment is the span of path between two adjacent anchor points. So in this case, this path only has 2 anchor points, so it's entirely consists of one segment. Now in the case of this path next to it, we have multiple anchor points in between the beginning and the end of the path. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 different segments, just like so. If we were to look at this path here, again, we cannot necessarily pick out the location of this center anchor point without that little red square. But because there is an anchor point in the center, that's going to mean that this path consists of 2 different segments. Now, again, we have one segment here and another 2 segments here. And when we begin looking over here at the shapes on the right, you'll notice here that we have 4 segments with this circle if it's got 4 anchor points, and the same is going to go for both the rectangle and the square here as well. Now again, the more anchor points you have, the more path segments that you're going to have, as we see with these 3 shapes down here below. So you can see here again we have a couple of little blue triangles highlighting the segments, but I didn't fill in the rest of that information for you. So path segments are important because we can actually select and manipulate a path just by grabbing its segment, or we can actually delete individual segments as well. So segments are another thing that you might key in on and begin to learn that term, because that's something that we're going to be talking about quite a bit in our Adobe Illustrator training. So there's one last little thing I want to talk to you about, kind of the anatomy of a vector object, and if I come over here, it's called control handles. Now you can't see that without selecting the actual path, and we're going to talk about selecting paths in the next lesson. But you can see here that each anchor point has what's known as control handles, and I'm having to zoom in fairly closely. This is actually a screenshot of myself selecting an anchor point. So if we focus here on this anchor point right here, you can see there's this little blue line, and there's actually a small blue dot at either end of that line. So there's actually 2 handles here, and each handle controls the direction the path flows through this anchor point. So this handle right here controls how this path right here is flowing out to the right. This handle right here controls how this path is flowing to the left. Now you may notice that the anchor points at either end of this path only have one visible handle. And the reason being is because I have this anchor point selected, so we can only see the handle that is adjacent to the selected anchor point here. So that's why you're not seeing the other handle protruding off the opposite end of these 2 anchor points on the beginning and the end of this path. But what you need to know about control handles is that they control the direction that a path flows through an anchor point. Now we're going to be looking at control handles and learning how to use them in an upcoming lesson. But this is really kind of the last anatomical feature that I wanted to talk to you about here in this lesson. So at this point, we're going to be moving on to the next lesson, and we're going to be learning about selecting and transforming our vector objects.